The courthouse clock struck 8, its echo vibrating through the marble halls like a warning bell. Julia Morgan stood at the defense table, her leather briefcase perched neatly beside her, a stack of documents spilling out like a flood she could no longer contain. Her hair, once a cascade of chestnut waves, was tied back in a hasty bun, streaks of gray woven through like threads of truth she had no time to hide. For 20 years, Julia had been a corporate lawyer in Boston. She had battled through the trenches of late-night depositions, 30-hour work sprints, and the unforgiving weight of billable hours. Her colleagues called her the Iron Lady for her stamina, her ability to push through exhaustion and win. She wore that badge proudly, until it began to feel less like a crown and more like chains. That morning, as she cross-examined a witness, she felt her throat tighten. Words that usually flowed with precision tangled on her tongue. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her pen. She masked it, of course. Lawyers were masters of masks, but inside she was unraveling. By the time the judge dismissed the court for recess, Julia could feel her heart pounding in her ears. She pressed her palms against the cool surface of the defense table, willing her breath to steady. "Pull it together," she whispered to herself. But her body wasn't listening anymore. Later that evening, Julia found herself in her car in the firm's underground garage, unable to turn the ignition. The day was over, yet she sat motionless, staring at the steering wheel as if it might offer her direction. She should have been driving home to her husband, Daniel, and their teenage daughter, Claire. Instead, she sat in silence, replaying the moment her chest tightened in court, the sweat gathering at the nape of her neck, the dizziness that had crept in. Was this what a panic attack felt like? The word terrified her. She had always been the composed one, the woman who handled mergers worth millions, who could stare down hostile opposing counsel without flinching. But that strength was eroding, leaving her with fragments of herself she no longer recognized. At home, Daniel noticed. He always did. "You're late again," he said gently as she entered the kitchen, dropping her bag by the door. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air. Claire had already eaten and was in her room, headphones clamped to her ears. Julia forced a smile. "Big case. You know how it goes." Daniel studied her. His once boyish face now lined with middle age, his eyes a mix of concern and weariness. "I know how it's been going for 20 years. But I also know you're not okay." The words pierced her more than any cross-examination ever had. She opened her mouth to argue, to deny it, but her throat closed. Instead, she leaned against the counter, the granite cold beneath her fingertips. For the first time in years, Julia felt tears welling up in her eyes. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of Daniel's breathing beside her. The house was quiet, but her mind was a storm. She thought about the law school debt she had long since paid off, the prestigious corner office she had fought to earn, the years of sacrificing weekends, birthdays, vacations. She thought about the migraines that had become more frequent, the prescription bottles in her drawer, the way Claire avoided asking her to come to school events because she already knew the answer. And she thought about the question she had been avoiding: was this all there was? The next morning, Julia sat in her office staring at the Boston skyline. The sun was rising, painting streaks of gold across the glass towers. For a moment, it was breathtaking. But her reflection in the window told a different story. Tired eyes, slumped shoulders, a woman trapped in a life that no longer fit. Her assistant knocked, interrupting her thoughts. "You have 3 conference calls before lunch, then the client dinner at 6. Julia nodded automatically. The machine kept running, whether she wanted it to or not. But something inside her shifted. She felt the weight of her own silence pressing down on her, heavier than any case file. When the assistant left, Julia whispered aloud, softly, as if testing the sound. "I can't do this anymore." That confession was the first crack in the armor. The world outside her office carried on. Traffic honked, emails pinged, deadlines loomed. But Julia sat frozen, feeling both terrified and strangely relieved. Admitting the truth, if only to herself, was like unlocking a door she didn't yet know how to walk through. That evening, while Daniel washed dishes and Claire scrolled on her phone, Julia lingered at the dining table, tracing the rim of her wine glass with her finger. "I think I need to make a change," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked up, suds dripping from his hands. "What kind of change?" She exhaled slowly. "A big one. I don't think I can be a lawyer anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and electrifying. Claire glanced up, startled. For a moment, the three of them sat in silence, the television humming faintly in the background. Daniel set down the sponge. "Then what do you want to be?" Julia swallowed. For now, she had no answer. Only a feeling, a pull towards something undefined, something that might heal the parts of her that law had broken. That night, in her journal, the one she rarely touched, she wrote, "I am 46. I have spent more than half my life in a profession that has drained me. I am tired of fighting battles that leave me empty. I don't know what's next, but I know it has to be something that matters. Something that helps women like me who are burning out quietly behind polished smiles." As the ink bled into the page, Julia felt a spark of clarity. Small, fragile, but real. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine, what if she could step off the treadmill? What if her second act wasn't about winning cases, but about saving lives, including her own? The following weeks felt like moving through molasses. Julia still went through the motions of her job, drafting contracts, preparing briefs, attending client dinners, but the rhythm had changed. She noticed how hollow her words sounded in meetings, how quickly her patience frayed during negotiations. The mask she'd worn so effortlessly for years was slipping. At first, she thought she was just tired. Everyone at the firm was tired. But there was something different now, a quiet voice inside her, whispering questions she couldn't ignore. One afternoon, while waiting for a conference call to begin, Julia scrolled through her phone absent-mindedly. An article caught her eye, "Why Midlife Women Are Burned Out, and What to Do About It." Normally she would have dismissed it, but today she clicked. The words hit too close. Women carrying invisible loads, balancing careers, families, aging parents, and expectations that never seem to end. She paused at a line, "Your second act can be the most fulfilling chapter of your life if you allow yourself to listen to what you truly need." Her breath caught. She locked her phone, embarrassed by the tears that stung her eyes, alone in her corner office. The whispers followed her home. On Saturday mornings, Julia used to savor an hour of yoga before errands. But lately, she found herself lingering at the community center after class, chatting with women her age. They spoke openly about insomnia, anxiety, hot flashes, and the constant juggling act of caring for teenagers and aging parents. Julia listened quietly, struck by how honest they were. No legal jargon, no competition, just truth. One woman, a nurse named Carol, mentioned she'd started seeing a health coach who specialized in midlife transitions. "It's changed my life," Carol said, smiling. "She doesn't just talk about diet or exercise. She helps me manage the emotional side of all this." Julia felt a strange pang. A mix of envy and curiosity. She wanted what Carol had, someone who could guide her through the storm. That night, unable to sleep, Julia sat at her kitchen table with a mug of chamomile tea. She opened her laptop and typed, "Career Change at 40s Women's Stories." Pages of articles, blog posts, and YouTube videos appeared. She read about a woman who left finance to become a teacher, another who left marketing to open a bakery. She devoured their stories, each one a flicker of possibility. Then she stumbled on a TED Talk, "Reinvention After 40, Finding Purpose." The speaker, a woman with silver hair and bright eyes, told the audience, "We spend the first half of our lives building careers, families, reputations. But often, those things don't feed our souls. The second half is our chance to ask, who do I want to be for the rest of my life?" Julia replayed the line over and over. Who do I want to be for the rest of my life? For the first time in years, she felt not just exhausted, but restless. Restless for something she couldn't yet name. One Sunday afternoon, she visited her parents in their small Cape Cod home. Her mother, now in her 70s, brewed coffee while Julia flipped through old photo albums. She paused at a picture of herself in college, long hair loose, laughing in the sunshine, notebook in hand. "You were always writing back then," her mother said, looking over her shoulder. "Your journals, your essays. You wanted to help people somehow." Julia smiled faintly. She had forgotten that part of herself. Law school had consumed her so completely that she'd buried that instinct to listen, to nurture. "Do you ever wish you'd done something different?" Julia asked quietly. Her mother stirred sugar into her coffee. "I think every woman wonders. But the question is, what do you want now?" Julia looked at her reflection in the coffee's dark surface. She didn't answer. Not yet. The shift became impossible to ignore when Claire, her 15-year-old daughter, spoke up. "Mom," Claire said one evening at dinner, "you're always so stressed. Do you even like being a lawyer?" Julia froze, fork halfway to her mouth. Daniel glanced at Claire, as if to say not now, but Julia raised a hand. "No, it's okay. She deserves an honest answer." She set the fork down and sighed. "There are parts one like. Helping clients, solving problems. But it's exhausting. It takes a lot out of me." Claire nodded, her expression unusually serious. "I just don't want you to get sick. You're always tired." The words lodged in Julia's chest like a stone. Her daughter saw her more clearly than she wanted to admit. That night, Julia cried quietly in the bathroom. Not from sadness exactly, but from the weight of truth spoken aloud by her child. The whispers became nudges. Her firm invited a guest speaker one afternoon, an expert on workplace wellness. Julia expected another shallow lecture about stress management, but the woman surprised her. She spoke about resilience, mindfulness, and the importance of mental health, especially for professionals under pressure. Julia leaned forward, scribbling notes. She felt her pulse quicken with recognition. Here was a language she craved, something human, beyond billable hours. After the talk, Julia lingered to thank the speaker. "Your words really resonated," she admitted. The woman smiled warmly. "You'd be surprised how many lawyers come up to me and say that. Have you ever considered working in this field?" Julia laughed nervously. "Me? No, I'm not. This isn't my world." "Sometimes," the woman said gently, "the thing we need most is hiding right where we least expect it." The words echoed long after Julia returned to her office. That evening, Julia found herself journaling again. "The law has taught me discipline, logic, and strength. But my heart aches for something more. I want to help women, not just win cases but heal. I don't even know what that means yet. But the idea won't leave me alone." As she closed the journal, Julia realized the whisper of change was no longer faint. It was growing louder, threading through her days, her nights, her very bones. And though she didn't yet know where it would lead, she was beginning to listen. The decision did not arrive like lightning. It crept in slowly, a tide rising beneath Julia's feet until she could no longer ignore that she was standing in water. At first, she tried to silence it. She doubled down at work, thinking if she just focused harder, the whispers of change would vanish. But the harder she tried, the more hollow it all felt. Drafting contracts felt like carving pieces of herself away. Client dinners drained her instead of energizing her. One evening, after another 12-hour day, Julia collapsed onto the living room sofa. Daniel brought her a glass of water and sat beside her. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said softly. She rubbed her temples. "I'm just tired." Daniel tilted his head. "No, this is different. You've been reading those reinvention blogs, watching those talks. You're thinking about something." Julia hesitated. Then, almost in a whisper, "What if I left law?" The words seemed to stop time. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Daniel's eyes widened. "Left? As in quit?" She nodded, heart pounding. "I can't keep doing this. It's breaking me. I need to find something else. Something that matters." Daniel leaned back, silent for a long moment. "What would you do instead?" Julia exhaled. "I don't know yet. But I keep coming back to this idea of helping women. Mental health, burnout, transitions, the things I'm going through. I want to be part of that." Daniel's brow furrowed. "That's a huge shift. We have a mortgage, college savings for Claire." "I know," Julia said quickly. "Believe me, I've thought about the money. But if I keep going like this, there won't be a me to worry about the mortgage." Her voice cracked. Daniel reached for her hand, squeezing it. "I don't want to lose you to this job either. But I'm scared, Jules. This is a leap into the unknown." "So am I," she admitted. "But maybe that's the point." At the firm, the idea of leaving felt even more impossible. One afternoon, Julia confided in her closest colleague, Mark, over coffee. He stared at her as if she'd grown two heads. "You're talking about throwing away 20 years of work," he said flatly. "I'm talking about saving my sanity," Julia countered. "Julia, everyone here is stressed. That's the job. You've built a reputation, a client base, an income people would kill for. You'd really give all that up?" She stirred her coffee, watching the swirl of cream dissolve. "Yes. If it means I can breathe again." Mark shook his head. "I just don't get it. You're one of the best. You can't just walk away." Julia smiled faintly. "Maybe being the best at something that's killing me isn't the prize I thought it was." That night, she lay awake again, the ceiling familiar as an old adversary. Her mind raced: bills, Claire's college fund, the fear of failure. But beneath the fear was something stronger, a pull toward life itself. She remembered the TED speaker's words: "Who do I want to be for the rest of my life? A lawyer, broken and exhausted? Or a woman who dared to start over?" The following week, Julia took a half-day and walked along the Charles River. It was early spring, the air crisp with the promise of change. She watched joggers, mothers pushing strollers, an older couple holding hands. Life in motion, unapologetic. She sat on a bench, journal in hand. For the first time, she wrote without hesitation. "I choose to leave law. I don't know how yet, but I know why. I choose health over exhaustion. I choose meaning over prestige. I choose to create a life that feels like mine." The words poured out, unstoppable. When she closed the journal, she felt lighter, as if she had set down a boulder she'd been carrying for years. The real test came when she told Claire. Over pizza one Friday night, Julia cleared her throat. "Sweetheart, I want to tell you something important. I've decided to leave the law firm." Claire's eyes widened. "Wait, you're quitting? Just like that?" "Not just like that," Julia said gently. "I've been thinking about it for a long time. It's time for me to do something that makes me happy." Claire studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Honestly? I think that's awesome. You're always telling me to follow my dreams. Maybe it's your turn." Julia blinked, startled by her daughter's wisdom. Then she laughed, a real laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep. On her final day at the firm, Julia packed her office slowly. The walls once plastered with certificates and framed verdicts looked bare. She placed her nameplate in the box last, pausing to trace the letters. Colleagues came by to offer polite congratulations, though some looked bewildered, even pitying. Mark gave her a stiff hug. "I still think you're crazy," he muttered. "Maybe," Julia said with a smile. "But maybe crazy is exactly what I need." As she rode the elevator down for the last time, briefcase in hand, Julia felt her chest tighten, but this time it wasn't panic. It was freedom. Fear still lingered, yes, but it pulsed with possibility. When the doors opened to the lobby, sunlight spilled in through the glass windows, brighter than she remembered. Julia stepped forward, into a life she was about to build from the ground up. The first morning after leaving the firm, Julia woke up expecting to hear her alarm at 5:30, her body already braced for the usual rush of emails and court prep. Instead, sunlight streamed through the blinds, warm and unhurried. For a moment she lay there, disoriented. The silence felt unnatural, like she had stepped into a world where time moved differently. Daniel stirred beside her. "No court today," he teased, his voice heavy with sleep. Julia smiled faintly. "No court today. No court ever again." The words still sounded foreign on her tongue. Strange, thrilling, terrifying. Within a week, Julia had enrolled in a certification program for holistic mental health coaching. The course was online but included weekend workshops in Cambridge. When she clicked register, her heart raced as if she were filing her first motion in court. But instead of dread, she felt something else: hope. Her first class was a virtual lecture on stress and the nervous system. Julia logged in early, her notebook open, pen poised. As the instructor greeted the students, Julia glanced at the gallery of faces, women in their 30s, 40s, 50s. Some smiled eagerly, others looked as nervous as she felt. "Welcome," the instructor said. "You're here because you want to help people heal. That begins with understanding your own journey." Julia inhaled deeply, struck by how different this sounded from her law school orientation all those years ago. Back then, it had been about competition, prestige climbing. Here, it was about connection. Still, starting over was humbling. During the first workshop, students practiced guided breathing exercises in pairs. Julia's partner, a woman named Rosa, spoke softly, "Close your eyes. Inhale through your nose, hold, exhale slowly." Julia tried, but her mind raced. She kept thinking about whether she was doing it right, whether she looked foolish. When it was her turn to guide Rosa, she stumbled over her words, her lawyer's precision failing her. Afterward she muttered, "I sounded ridiculous." Rosa smiled kindly. "You sounded human. That's what matters." Julia flushed, but her heart softened. She was so used to being flawless, to winning. Maybe imperfection was part of the point. At home, Daniel and Claire noticed changes almost immediately. "You're different," Claire said one evening as they cooked dinner together. "Lighter. Like you're not carrying this giant invisible backpack anymore." Julia laughed. "That's exactly how it feels. Though sometimes I wonder if I've lost my mind." Daniel, chopping onions at the counter, glanced up. "You haven't lost it. You're finding it." The words lingered with her, warming her like a quiet blessing. The financial strain, however, was real. Without her law salary, Julia became hyper-aware of every expense, the rising grocery bill, the college fund contributions. She and Daniel sat down one Sunday afternoon with a spreadsheet, tallying savings, projecting costs. "We'll need to tighten up," Daniel said gently. "But we can make this work if we're careful." Julia chewed her lip. "Are you sure you're okay with this? I know it's a big adjustment." Daniel reached across the table, covering her hand. "Julia, I'd rather live simply with a wife who's alive and happy than luxuriously with one who's falling apart." Her throat tightened. She blinked back tears. "Thank you. That means everything." In class, Julia found herself drawn to the modules on midlife transitions. The instructors spoke about the unique struggles women face in their 40s and 50s, identity shifts, empty nest syndrome, caring for aging parents, menopause, career burnout. Julia filled pages of notes, her pen flying. She wasn't just learning theories, she was living them. During one session, the instructor said, "When women come to you, they're not just looking for advice. They're looking for someone who understands what it feels like to wake up at 46 and wonder, 'Who am I now?'" Julia's chest tightened. That was exactly her question. Maybe by finding her answer, she could help others find theirs. Slowly, her confidence grew. She began volunteering at a local community center, leading short workshops on stress management. The first time, only 3 women showed up, one in her 50s, one newly divorced, one juggling 2 jobs. Julia guided them through a breathing exercise, her voice shaking at first, then settling into a steady rhythm. When the session ended, one woman whispered, "Thank you. I haven't felt this calm in months." Julia drove home that evening with tears in her eyes, her chest brimming with something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. Of course, doubts still crept in. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Julia sometimes stared at her old law degree on the wall, wondering if she had been reckless. She thought of her colleagues climbing the firm ladder, their names etched on glossy brochures. Would she regret stepping away? But then she remembered the panic attacks, the hollow victories, the look on Claire's face when she said, "I just don't want you to get sick." No, she thought. This is the right road. Even if it's rocky, it's mine. By the end of her first semester, Julia's journal was filled with reflections. "I am learning to breathe again. To listen. To speak from my heart instead of my head. I don't know exactly where this will lead, but for the first time in decades, I'm not afraid of the unknown. I'm excited by it." One evening, she read a passage aloud to Daniel. He smiled. "You sound like a different person." "Maybe," Julia said, closing the journal. "Or maybe I'm finally just being myself." When she received her first certificate of completion, Julia held the paper in her hands as if it were fragile glass. It wasn't as prestigious as her law degree, but it felt more powerful. This wasn't about proving her intellect. It was about proving her courage. She slipped the certificate into a frame and hung it above her desk at home. Beneath it, she taped a note in her own handwriting. "Second acts are not about starting from zero. They're about using the wisdom you've earned to build something new." As she stepped back to admire it, Julia smiled. The whisper of change had become a voice now, steady, certain, calling her forward. Julia once imagined that once she left the law, life would feel instantly lighter. In many ways it did. Her shoulders weren't hunched with constant stress, her migraines came less often, but the road ahead wasn't smooth. Resistance rose up like waves, testing her resolve. The first resistance came from her bank account. She and Daniel had built a comfortable life on her 6-figure salary. Vacations to the Cape, dinners out, Claire's private school tuition, it had all felt manageable. Without her paycheck, every expense glowed red. One evening, Julia sat at the kitchen table with bills spread out like trial exhibits. Daniel leaned over her shoulder. "We can cut the cleaning service," he said. "And maybe fewer dinners out." Julia nodded, but the guilt was sharp. "I feel like I've dragged us down." Daniel shook his head. "You've given us back you. That's worth more than money. But yeah, we'll need to adjust." The words were loving, but Julia still felt the pinch. Each check written, each card swiped, came with a whisper, was this a mistake? The second resistance came from people she least expected, old friends. At a reunion dinner with her law school group, Julia braced herself. The wine flowed, the conversation buzzed with promotions, partnerships, high-profile cases. When Julia mentioned her new path, the table fell oddly quiet. "So you're coaching now?" one friend Erica said, eyebrows raised. "Like life coaching?" Julia forced a smile. "Yes, but focused on mental health for women in midlife." Erica's lips twitched. "Interesting. I mean, after all the years you spent building your career, that's quite a pivot." Another friend chimed in. "Does it even pay?" Julia laughed lightly, deflecting, but inside, the doubt gnawed. As she drove home that night, she heard their voices on repeat. "Throwing it all away. Quite a pivot. Does it even pay?" The third resistance came from within. One gray morning, Julia sat at her desk preparing material for a workshop. She stared at the blinking cursor, frozen. The words wouldn't come. She thought of the women who might attend, expecting wisdom, guidance. Who was she to give it? The old voice of her lawyer self returned, sharp and judgmental. "You're not an expert. You're not licensed as a therapist. This is just a phase. You'll embarrass yourself." Her chest tightened, the familiar squeeze of anxiety. She closed the laptop and buried her face in her hands. For a long time, she stayed there, the silence heavy. That weekend, Julia almost backed out of a speaking commitment at the community center. Only 10 women were expected, but it felt monumental. "What if I freeze?" she asked Daniel. "What if they realize I have no idea what I'm doing?" Daniel handed her a cup of tea. "Then you'll be honest. And honesty is more powerful than pretending." She frowned. "Law taught me to never let them see weakness." "Maybe coaching will teach you the opposite," Daniel said. The day of the workshop, Julia stood at the front of a modest room. The women sat in folding chairs, clutching notebooks. Some looked tired, others skeptical. Julia's palms were damp. She began haltingly, talking about stress and midlife burnout. But then she paused, took a breath, and spoke from the heart. "I'm not here as someone who has it all figured out. I'm here as someone who's been where you are. I was a lawyer for 20 years, and it nearly broke me. I know what it feels like to wake up at 46 and wonder, is this all there is?" Heads lifted. Eyes softened. Julia felt the air shift. One woman in the back nodded vigorously. Another wiped her eyes. Julia continued, her voice steady now. "We're told to keep pushing, to endure. But what if midlife isn't the end of something, it's the beginning of something new? What if it's permission to finally take care of ourselves?" By the time she finished, the room was quiet, but charged. One woman approached her afterward, gripping her hand. "You spoke my story. Thank you." Julia drove home with tears in her eyes, realizing something profound. Resistance wasn't a sign she was failing. It was proof she was on the right path. But not all resistance could be smoothed over in one workshop. The following week, Julia received a polite but firm email from her former mentor at the law firm. "Julia, I admire your courage, but I urge you to reconsider. You had an exceptional future here. Coaching is fine as a hobby, but don't throw away the career you built." Julia read it 3 times, the words stinging. She almost replied with justification, but then stopped. Instead, she closed the email and whispered to herself, "That's his fear, not mine." It was a turning point. She realized resistance wasn't something to defeat, it was something to recognize, to walk through. One night, journaling by lamplight, Julia wrote, "The old world will keep tugging at me, money, prestige, people who don't understand. But every time I stand in front of women and speak from my heart, I feel alive. That has to mean something." She underlined the words twice, then closed the journal. By summer, the resistance hadn't vanished, but Julia had grown stronger. She no longer needed everyone's approval. She no longer flinched at her dwindling savings or her friends' raised eyebrows. Instead, she focused on the faces of the women who thanked her, on Claire's smile when she saw her mother laugh again, on the quiet strength that bloomed inside her each time she chose courage over fear. For the first time, Julia began to see resistance not as an enemy, but as a rite of passage. Julia's first paying client arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in September. She had rented a small office space above a yoga studio in Cambridge. The room was simple, 2 armchairs facing each other, a small desk in the corner, a diffuser releasing the faint scent of lavender. Gone were the heavy oak desks and leather chairs of the law firm. Here, she wanted lightness. Her heart pounded as she glanced at the clock. At exactly 10, the door opened and a woman stepped in. "Hi, I'm Linda," she said, shaking Julia's hand nervously. She was about 50, her shoulders tense, her eyes ringed with fatigue. Julia smiled warmly. "I'm Julia. Please, have a seat." As they settled into the chairs, Julia felt a strange mix of nerves and calm. She wasn't cross-examining. She wasn't strategizing. She was listening. Linda spoke hesitantly at first, about caring for her mother with Alzheimer's, juggling a demanding job, feeling invisible in her own life. "I don't even recognize myself anymore," she confessed, her voice breaking. Julia leaned forward gently. "I know that feeling. You're not alone. Let's take this step by step." For the next hour, Julia guided her through breathing exercises, journaling prompts, and small practices for self-care. By the end, Linda's shoulders had dropped slightly, her voice steadier. As she left, Linda said quietly, "This is the first time in months I've felt heard. Thank you." When the door closed, Julia sat in silence, tears filling her eyes. She had once measured success by verdicts and contracts. Now success was this, a woman walking out a little lighter than she came in. Word spread slowly, but steadily. A friend referred a friend. A woman from her yoga class booked a session. Then another from the community center. Each story was different, but the themes were familiar: burnout, loneliness, the ache of midlife reinvention. There was Angela, 48, a marketing executive who admitted she cried in her car before work. There was Diane, 52, whose youngest child had just left for college, leaving her adrift in an empty house. There was Sophia, 45, recently divorced, trying to rebuild her confidence after years of neglect. Julia listened to them all, her notebook filling not with arguments or case law, but with patterns of human pain and hope. Still, doubts resurfaced. After one particularly emotional session, Julia worried she had said the wrong thing. "What if I'm not helping? What if I make things worse?" she confided to Daniel that night. He looked at her firmly. "Julia, do you see their faces when they leave your office? That's your answer." She nodded slowly. He was right. It wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. Claire, too, noticed the difference. "You actually look excited to go to work now," she said one morning as Julia packed her bag. Julia laughed. "That's because I am." "Good," Claire said with a grin. "It's kind of inspiring, you know? Seeing you start over like this." Julia blinked, caught off guard. "Really?" "Yeah. It makes me think, maybe I don't have to have it all figured out at 18. If you can reinvent yourself at 46, I can figure it out later too." Julia hugged her daughter tightly. That was perhaps the greatest gift of all, showing Claire that change was possible at any age. As Julia gained confidence, she began to design group workshops. The first one drew only 6 women, gathered in a circle in her modest office. "Tonight," Julia began, "we're going to talk about boundaries, how to say no without guilt." The women laughed knowingly, sharing stories of overcommitment and resentment. Julia guided them through exercises, role-playing, and open discussion. By the end, the room was buzzing with laughter and connection. One woman said, "I thought I was the only one struggling with this. It feels so good to know I'm not alone." Julia walked home that night under the streetlights, her steps light. She wasn't just coaching individuals, she was building community. Her old life, however, still lurked like a shadow. One afternoon, she passed the courthouse on her way to lunch. For a moment, she stood staring at its imposing columns, memories flooding back, the arguments, the adrenaline, the long hours. A younger colleague spotted her and called out, "Julia, we miss you around here. You should come back, there's a new case you'd be perfect for." Julia smiled politely, but inside she felt a jolt of clarity. Once, she would have dropped everything for that invitation. Now, the thought of stepping back into that world made her stomach clench. As she walked away, she whispered to herself, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." By winter, Julia had a steady trickle of clients. Not enough to replace her old income, but enough to prove this wasn't just a fantasy. She designed a simple website with Daniel's help, posting her story and services. She began sharing small reflections on social media, writing about midlife burnout, self-care, and resilience. The responses surprised her. Women messaged from across the country, "Your words are exactly what I needed today. I thought I was alone. How can I work with you?" Each message was a reminder that her story mattered, not as a lawyer, but as a woman willing to be vulnerable. One snowy evening, Julia closed her office after a long day. She lingered by the window, watching flakes drift under the streetlight. She thought about Linda, Angela, Diane, Sophia, and the others. Each had walked into her life with burdens, and each had left a little lighter. She thought about her own journey, from panic attacks in a courtroom to laughter in a circle of women. For the first time, she felt the contours of her new identity solidifying. She was no longer Julia Morgan, corporate attorney. She was Julia Morgan, coach, guide, companion through the storms of midlife. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew one thing with absolute clarity: she had chosen right. Julia didn't notice the transformation at first. It crept in quietly, not in dramatic moments but in small shifts, tiny adjustments that slowly wove together into something unrecognizable from her old life. One morning in early spring, she caught her reflection in the mirror and blinked. Her face looked softer, her eyes brighter. The deep frown lines etched from years of stress seemed lighter. She hadn't realized how much her old job had carved fatigue into her skin. Claire noticed too. "Mom, you don't look tired all the time anymore," she said over breakfast. Julia laughed. "That's because I actually sleep now." Sleep had once been elusive, her nights broken by anxious thoughts of briefs and deadlines. Now she had a routine: herbal tea, journaling, breathing exercises. It wasn't perfect, but she no longer dreaded the night. Her body transformed alongside her mind. She returned to yoga with renewed dedication, no longer rushing through poses but savoring them. She began running by the Charles River, the crisp air filling her lungs. At first, she could barely jog a mile. But each week, her stamina grew. One Saturday morning, after finishing 3 miles without stopping, she raised her arms in triumph. Daniel, jogging beside her, laughed. "Who are you and what have you done with my wife?" Julia grinned, cheeks flushed. "Maybe I'm finally becoming myself." Friendships blossomed too. Through her coaching workshops, she met women who shared her values: open, vulnerable, eager to grow. They gathered for coffee after sessions, trading stories about parenting, aging, and dreams deferred. One evening, she hosted a small dinner party at home with 3 of these new friends. As laughter filled the kitchen, Julia felt something she hadn't felt in years: belonging without pretense. She didn't have to impress anyone with titles or victories. She could just be Julia. Later that night, as she washed dishes, Daniel kissed her cheek. "I love seeing you like this. Happy. Alive." Julia smiled. "I love feeling it." But perhaps the most profound transformation was invisible: her relationship with herself. She began journaling not only about fears, but about gratitude. She meditated for 10 minutes each morning, something she once would have dismissed as impractical. She let herself cry when emotions bubbled up, instead of burying them. For years, She had armored herself in logic and resilience. Now she was learning softness, not as weakness, but as strength. Professionally, her transformation showed in her work. Her coaching practice grew steadily. She developed signature programs on topics like navigating midlife change and reclaiming your energy after burnout. Women began referring their sisters, co-workers, and friends. One client, Angela, who once cried in her car before work, told Julia months later, "I've started painting again. I haven't felt this alive in years." Julia's heart swelled. This wasn't just work. It was ministry, a calling. Social media, once something Julia barely touched, became a platform for her voice. She began writing short reflections. Midlife isn't a crisis, it's an awakening. It's not too late to rewrite your story. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's essential. Her posts gained traction, resonating with women she'd never met. Some messaged her privately, "Your words made me feel less alone." One evening, after a particularly heartfelt post went semi-viral, Julia turned to Daniel. "Can you believe this? People actually want to hear what I have to say." Daniel smiled. "Of course they do. You've been waiting your whole life to tell the truth." The transformation reached her family too. Claire, once cautious about her mother's stress, now leaned on Julia more. They took long walks together, talking about school, friendships, even boys. One evening, as they walked under the pink glow of a spring sunset, Claire said, "You're my role model, you know." Julia stopped, touched. "Me? Really?" "Yeah. Not because you were a lawyer. Because you were brave enough to change when you weren't happy. That's rare." Julia hugged her tightly, tears stinging her eyes. She realized her transformation wasn't just about saving herself, it was about modeling freedom for the next generation. Yet, the most surprising shift came in how Julia viewed her past. One afternoon, while cleaning out old files, she stumbled upon a trial transcript. Instead of bitterness, she felt gratitude. Law had taught her discipline, confidence, the ability to stand in front of a room and speak. She no longer saw those years as wasted. They were stepping stones. She whispered aloud, "Thank you. But I don't need you anymore." And just like that, she closed the box and set it aside. By summer, Julia felt unrecognizable from the woman who once sat paralyzed in her car at the courthouse. She wasn't defined by exhaustion or panic anymore. She was defined by growth, by courage, by connection. One evening, journaling by lamplight, she wrote, "Transformation isn't a single moment. It's 1,000 tiny choices. Each time I chose courage over fear, honesty over perfection, rest over hustle, I transformed. And I'm still transforming." She underlined the last sentence twice, closed the journal, and smiled. Julia laughed, but inside, a flame sparked. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe it was possible. Months later, she returned to the courthouse, not as a lawyer but as a speaker. A legal association had invited her to talk about mental health for attorneys. As she stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of weary faces, she felt a surge of compassion. She knew their pain intimately. "I left this world not because I failed," she said gently, "but because I refused to fail myself. If you're sitting here tonight wondering if you can keep going, you're not alone. And you don't have to stay trapped in a life that's hurting you. Change is terrifying, yes. But it can also be the most beautiful gift you give yourself." The silence afterward was thick with recognition. Then slowly, applause rose, filling the room. Julia stepped down from the podium, heart swelling. She realized she had come full circle, returning not to practice law, but to extend a lifeline to those still drowning in it. One evening, months later, Julia sat by the window of her office as twilight fell. The city lights shimmered on the river, and she sipped tea, her journal open on her lap. She thought about the journey, the panic attacks, the late-night doubts, the resistance from friends, the terrifying leap into the unknown. And then she thought about what she had gained: health, joy, purpose, freedom. At 46, she had felt broken. At 48, she felt whole. She wrote in her journal, "This isn't the end of my story. It's the beginning of my second act. And this time, I'm writing it on my own terms." She closed the journal, smiling. For once, the unknown ahead didn't scare her. It thrilled her.